The nurse's pen hovered over the clipboard as she looked at me and asked, "Who's watching your babies?" And I remember staring at the clock on the wall, 6:14 a.m. Like somehow the answer would appear there if I waited long enough, but it didn't because there was no one, and that was the moment I realized I was about to go into surgery completely alone while my 2-year-old twin sat in a hospital waiting room with a diaper bag, a half-empty bottle, and no one from my family willing to show up. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 31 years old, and this morning my parents refused to help me when I needed them the most. I wish I could say that was the first time they let me down, but it wasn't, it never was, because in our family there were always 2 daughters, but only one who mattered. My older sister Rachel was the one they invested in, the one they called promising, the one who got everything from college tuition to a down payment on her first house in Denver, while I was the one they described as independent, which was just their way of saying I was on my own always, even when I had my twins, even when I was working 2 part-time jobs just to keep up with rent and daycare. They told me I was strong, that I didn't need help, and I believed them for a long time. I built my life around that idea, that if I just worked harder, asked for less, expected nothing, it wouldn't hurt as much. But sitting there in that hospital gown, with a plastic wristband cutting into my skin and a nurse waiting for an answer I didn't have, it hit differently, because this wasn't about pride or independence anymore. This was about survival, about responsibility, about 2 little kids who depended on me and a surgery that couldn't be delayed. The doctor had been clear the night before. "We need to do this as soon as possible." And I nodded like I understood, like I had a plan, but the truth was I didn't. Not until I called my mom. I remember standing in my kitchen at 9:32 p.m., one twin asleep on my shoulder, the other crying in the background, and saying, "I need help tomorrow, just a few hours, I have surgery." There was a pause, just long enough for hope to sneak in, and then she said, "We'll see what we can do." And for a moment I let myself believe it. I packed their bags that night like someone was actually coming, labeled bottles, laid out clothes, wrote down feeding times on a sticky note and stuck it to the diaper bag. I even set out an extra set of keys on the counter, just in case they needed to let themselves in. I went to bed thinking maybe this time would be different, maybe this was the moment. Things shifted, but at 5:47 a.m. my phone buzzed and I saw my dad's name. I answered immediately, heart racing, already picturing them pulling into the parking lot. And he said flat, like he was commenting on the weather, "We're not coming, Emily, we have plans, you'll have to figure it out." I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe I misheard. "What do you mean you're not coming?" And he sighed, annoyed, like I was asking too much, like I always asked too much. "It's not our responsibility, you chose this life." And then he hung up just like that, no apology, no hesitation, just a dial tone and the sound of my entire plan collapsing in real time. I stood there in the dark kitchen, both twins awake now, one tugging at my sleeve, the other crying louder, and I realized something I should have accepted years ago. I was never going to be the daughter they showed up for, not even today, not even now, and somehow I still had to find a way to walk into that hospital and sign those papers like everything was under control, like I wasn't breaking apart quietly inside. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known standing there at 6:14 a.m. with no one to call, was that a few hours later, someone else would walk through those hospital doors, and everything my parents thought they could ignore would finally come back to them in a way they never expected. I signed the consent form with a hand that did not feel like mine, like it belonged to someone steadier, someone who actually had a plan. While inside my head everything was loud and chaotic and unfinished, the nurse gave me a small nod and clipped the form to the chart before asking again, softer this time, "Are you sure there is no one we can call?" And I forced a smile that did not reach my eyes and said, "No, it is just me." Because explaining the truth would have taken too long and I did not have the energy to unpack years of quiet rejection in a hospital hallway. They handed me a plastic bracelet for each of my twins with their names printed in block letters, Oliver and Mason, and I crouched down to their level, smoothing Oliver's hair back, while Mason clutched my sleeve with sticky fingers. "Mommy will be right back, okay?" I said, even though I had no idea how long right back would actually be, because surgery time is never exact, because recovery is never predictable, because nothing about this felt certain except the fact that I was doing it alone. A young nurse named Caitlin offered to sit with them until I figured something out, and I could see the concern in her eyes, the unspoken question of how someone ends up in this position. I thanked her more times than necessary, like gratitude could somehow make up for the gap my own family left behind. As they wheeled me toward pre-op, the fluorescent lights above blurred together into one long strip of white, and I kept thinking about that moment the night before when my mother said, "We will see what we can do." How those words had felt like a promise at the time, how I had built an entire plan around something that was never real. I replayed it over and over, trying to find the exact point where I should have known better, where I should have recognize the pattern, but the truth is I did know. I just wanted to believe this time would be different because this time felt different, this time was bigger, this time involved my children, but to them it was still just me, just Emily, the one who could handle it, the one who always figured it out. In pre-op, they asked me a series of routine questions: allergies, medications, last time I ate, and I answered automatically like I was reading from a script I had memorized, while my mind drifted somewhere else entirely, to a kitchen table 10 years ago where my dad told me, "You are not like Rachel, you have to work harder for things." And I nodded back then too, accepted it as fact, shaped my life around it, and now here I was, proving him right in the worst possible way, figuring it out again just like he said I would. A doctor introduced himself, explained the procedure one more time, calm and professional, and I nodded like I understood every word, even though my focus kept slipping back to the waiting room, to two small boys who did not understand why their mother was leaving them with a stranger. I asked one last time before they rolled me in, "Can someone check on my kids?" And the nurse squeezed my hand and said, "We will take care of them." And for a second that kindness almost broke me more than my parents' absence did, because it showed me exactly what I had been missing: not money, not favors, just basic care, basic presence, the kind that should not have to be earned, the kind that should not feel like a luxury. As the doors to the operating room opened, cold air hitting my skin, I closed my eyes and tried to hold on to one steady thought: just get through this, just wake up, just go back to them, because they are the only ones who have ever needed me without conditions. But somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a quiet shift happening, something I could not fully name yet, something that felt like the beginning of understanding that maybe this was not just another moment to endure. Maybe this was the moment everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was about to change. I just did not realize yet who was already on their way to make sure of it. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes you instantly aware that something is missing, like when you reach for your phone in the dark and it is not where you left it. I blinked against the overhead lights, my throat dry, my body heavy, and for a split second I forgot where I was, until the steady beep of a monitor pulled me back. Hospital, surgery. And then it hit me all at once, the twins. I tried to sit up too quickly and a nurse was suddenly there, a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Easy, Emily, the procedure went well, you need to rest." But I shook my head, voice barely working. "My boys, where are they?" And she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying, "They are safe." Which should have been enough, but it was not, because safe did not tell me who was with them. Safe did not tell me if they were scared, if they were crying, if they were asking for me and not understanding why I was not there. I forced myself to focus, to push through the fog of anesthesia. "Who is with them?" I asked again, slower this time, and she gave me a small smile that felt like it was hiding something. "You had someone come in for them," she said, and for a second my mind jumped to the impossible. My parents. Maybe they changed their minds, maybe guilt finally caught up to them, maybe they showed up when it mattered, but that thought did not sit right. It felt too easy, too out of character, and deep down I knew better. I always knew better. "Who?" I pressed, and the nurse glanced toward the doorway like she was checking something before answering. "An older gentleman," he said. "He was family." And that was the moment my confusion shifted into something sharper, because there was only one person that description could fit, and he was the last person I expected to walk through those doors: my grandfather, William Carter. We had not spoken in months, not since the last family gathering where my father dismissed me in front of everyone, and Grandpa had gone quiet in a way that felt heavier than anger. He was not someone who interfered, not openly. He watched, he listened, and when he did speak, it meant something. I lay back against the pillow, heart starting to race for a completely different reason now, trying to piece together how he even knew I had not called him. I had not told anyone outside of that one conversation with my parents, and yet somehow, he was here in the same building with my children, and that did not happen by accident. He brought everything they needed. The nurse added, almost casually, like it was just another detail, but it was not, because I had packed everything myself. I had prepared for my parents, not for him. So how did he know what to bring? How did he know the timing, the urgency, the situation, unless someone told him? Or unless he had been paying attention in a way no one else in my family ever did? I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that realization settle in. The contrast was almost too sharp to process. The same family that could not spare a few hours to help me had someone who crossed that distance without being asked, without hesitation, and that meant something was already shifting, something I could feel but not fully see yet. "Do you want me to bring him in?" the nurse asked, and I nodded before I could even think about it, because whatever was happening, whatever he knew, whatever brought him here, I needed to understand it. But what I did not realize yet was that he did not just come to sit with my kids. He came with something else, something my parents had no idea existed, something that was already setting The stage for a moment they would not be able to ignore this time. The door opened slowly, not rushed, not uncertain, just deliberate. And I knew it was him before I even saw his face because no one else in my family moved like that, steady, controlled, like every step had already been decided long before it happened. My grandfather walked into the room wearing the same charcoal coat I had seen him wear for years, the one that always made him look like he belonged somewhere more important than wherever he actually was, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He just looked at me, really looked at me in a way that made it impossible to hide how exhausted I was, how much this had taken out of me, and then he nodded once like he had just confirmed something to himself. "You made it through," he said, his voice low and even, and I swallowed hard. "The boys?" I asked immediately because nothing else mattered, not yet, and he stepped closer, setting a small leather bag down on the chair beside my bed. "They are fine, Emily. They ate, they slept for a bit, and they are asking for you, which is a good sign." There was a calmness in the way he said it that settled something inside me. Not completely, but enough to breathe again. Enough to feel like the world had not completely slipped out of control. "How did you know?" I asked because that question had been sitting in my chest since the nurse spoke his name without saying it, and he held my gaze for a second longer than usual before answering. "I was told." Simple, direct, but not complete. I could hear it in the way he paused just slightly before the last word, like there was more behind it, more he was choosing not to say yet. "Who told you?" I pressed, and he glanced toward the window, not avoiding the question, just delaying it. "That part can wait," he said. And that was when I realized this was not just a visit, this was something else, something structured, something intentional, because my grandfather did not do anything halfway, not conversations, not decisions, not moments like this. He reached into the leather bag and pulled out a neatly folded blanket, the one I kept at the bottom of my diaper bag, the one I had packed the night before for someone else to use, and he placed it gently on the chair. "You prepared well," he added, almost like he was acknowledging something my parents never had, the effort, the planning, the way I always made sure everything was handled even when no one helped me, and that small recognition hit harder than I expected because it was so rare, so unfamiliar. "They said they could not come," I heard myself say, the words slipping out before I could stop them, not as a complaint, not even as an accusation, just a statement of fact, and he did not react immediately. He did not sigh or shake his head. He just nodded again, slower this time, like he had already accounted for that, like it fit into a pattern he had been observing for a long time. "I know," he said, and those two words carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it meant this was not new to him. It meant he had been watching, noticing, keeping track in a way no one else had. I shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as the movement reminded me I was still recovering. "You should not have had to handle this alone," he continued, and there it was again, that quiet certainty, not sympathy, not pity, just a clear statement of what should have been true. And for the first time I felt something shift inside me that was not just pain or exhaustion. It was something closer to clarity, like pieces of a picture I had been trying to ignore were finally lining up. "But you did," he added, and then, after a brief pause, "And that matters." I looked at him, trying to understand what he meant, because it sounded like more than just encouragement. It sounded like a conclusion, like he had already reached a decision about something I was not aware of yet. He reached back into the bag and this time pulled out a slim folder, dark blue, edges perfectly aligned, the kind of folder that does not hold casual paperwork, the kind that signals something formal, something prepared in advance, and he placed it on the bedside table without opening it, without explaining it, just letting it sit there between us. "There are things your parents assumed would never be questioned," he said quietly, his eyes meeting mine again. "They were wrong." And I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever he had brought with him was not just about today, not just about stepping in when they refused. It was about something bigger, something that had been building long before this morning, something that was about to surface whether they were ready for it or not. And as I stared at that folder, I understood one thing clearly: this was not over, not even close. I kept staring at the folder like it might open itself if I waited long enough, like the answers inside would somehow explain everything that had never made sense in my family. But it just sat there, perfectly still, the edges too clean, too intentional, and that made it harder to ignore. "What is that?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I expected, because something about the way he placed it there made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I was not fully prepared to see yet. My grandfather adjusted his coat slightly before taking a seat beside the bed. Not rushed, not dramatic, just measured. "Something that should have been addressed a long time ago," he said, and I felt that same shift again, the one that started in the operating room, like the ground under everything I thought I understood was starting to move. I do not understand, I admitted because I did not yet, not completely, and he nodded like he expected that, like confusion was part of the process. You were not supposed to, he replied. And that answer landed heavier than anything else he had said so far. Because it meant this was not just about my parents not showing up. Today, it meant there were things kept from me on purpose, decisions made without me, conclusions drawn about my life that I was never included in. And suddenly the years of being treated like an afterthought did not feel random anymore. They felt structured, intentional, like part of a system I had never been allowed to see. Your father believes certain things about responsibility, he continued, his tone calm but precise. He believes investment should go where it yields the highest return. And the words hit me instantly because I had heard that logic before, not in those exact terms, but in every decision they ever made, every time Rachel was chosen, every time I was told to figure things out on my own, every time my needs were quietly dismissed as less important, less urgent, less worthy. He has always seen you as capable, my grandfather added, and I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because I knew what that meant in our family. Capable did not mean valued, capable meant expendable. Capable meant you could be left behind because you would survive it? And Rachel? I asked before I could stop myself because even now, even here that comparison still existed, still shaped everything, and he did not hesitate. Rachel has always been seen as an asset that needed protection, he said plainly, and there it was, the entire hierarchy laid out in one sentence, not softened, not disguised, just stated, and hearing it that clearly made something inside me settle in a way I did not expect. Not relief, not exactly, but clarity, like I was finally looking at something directly instead of trying to pretend it was not there. So this is just how it is, I said, more to myself than to him because that had always been the conclusion. Accept it, adapt to it, move around it, but he shook his head slowly, and that was the first time his expression shifted into something firmer, something closer to resolve. No, he said, and that single word changed the entire tone of the room. That is how it has been allowed to be. He corrected, and I felt my attention lock onto him completely now because this was different. This was not explanation. This was direction. There is a difference, he continued, between what exists and what continues. And I followed the meaning even if I did not yet understand the full scope of it, because it sounded like something was about to change, not eventually, not hypothetically, but soon. He reached forward and lightly tapped the folder with 2 fingers. This addresses that difference, he said, and I swallowed, my eyes dropping to it again, because now it did not just feel important, it felt inevitable, like whatever was inside had already set something in motion. Why now? I asked, because timing mattered, because this could not be coincidence, not with him, not like this, and he held my gaze without hesitation, because today removed any doubt. He answered, and that was when I felt it fully, not just the shift but the weight behind it, because my parents refusing to help was not just another disappointment, it was proof that whatever he had been watching, whatever he had been considering, had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. And as I looked at that folder, I realized something I had never allowed myself to think before. Maybe this was not just about getting through another moment alone, maybe this was the beginning of not having to anymore. But I still did not know what opening it would actually mean. And something told me that once I did, there would be no going back to the version of my life I had been living before. I did not open the folder right away. Not because I did not want to know, but because something in me understood that once I did, whatever was written inside would change more than just this moment. It would change how I saw everything that came before it. And I was not sure I was ready to face that all at once. My grandfather seemed to sense that hesitation because he did not push, he did not reach for it or slide it closer. He simply let it sit there between us like a quiet truth waiting to be acknowledged. You do not have to decide anything today, he said, his voice steady, but you do need to understand what has already been decided for you. And that phrasing caught my attention immediately, because it implied something had been happening without my knowledge for a long time, something structured, something deliberate, not just random moments of neglect or favoritism, but actual decisions, actual planning. I shifted slightly against the pillows, still sore, still trying to stay present through the lingering fog in my head. What do you mean decided for me? I asked, and he leaned back just slightly, folding his hands in a way that made it clear he was choosing his words carefully. Your father has been organizing his estate for years, he said, and I felt a small, almost automatic tightening in my chest at the word estate, because that was never something I was included in, never something I was even meant to think about. Those conversations happened behind closed doors, usually with Rachel present, never with me. He made it very clear how he intended to distribute things, my grandfather continued, and I let out a quiet breath, not surprised, not really, because I already knew how that would look. I had seen it play out in smaller ways my entire life. Rachel first, me second, if at all. And you were not part of that plan, he added, not unkindly, just plainly, and hearing it said out loud should have hurt more than it did, but instead it felt like confirmation, like something I had always sensed finally being named. I figured. I said, my voice almost flat because there was no point pretending otherwise, not here, not now, but he shook his head slightly. You should not have had to figure it out, he corrected, and there was that difference again, the way he separated what was from what should have been, and I realized he was not just explaining the situation, he was reframing it, shifting it from something I was supposed to accept into something that could be challenged. There are documents in that folder, he continued, nodding toward it, that reflect those decisions and others that override them, and that was the first time I felt a flicker of something new. Not just confusion or hurt, but curiosity, sharp and immediate. Override. I repeated because that was not a word I had ever associated with my position in this family. I was used to adapting, not overriding, to accepting, not changing, and he met my gaze directly. Yes, he said. Because your father is not the only one who has a say in how things are structured. And that was when it started to become clear that this was bigger than I thought. Bigger than just a disagreement or a moment of stepping in. This was about authority, about control, about who actually determined what mattered and who did not. I did not step in today just because you needed help with your boys, he added, and I felt my attention sharpen even more, because that confirmed what I had already started to suspect, that this was not just about the present, it was about something that had been building long before this morning. I stepped in because today confirmed a pattern that can no longer be ignored. He continued, and those words settled heavily, because they echoed something I had felt but never fully allowed myself to articulate, that this was not isolated, this was not accidental. This was a pattern, consistent, repeated, reinforced over years. And what does that mean? I asked quietly because now I needed to know not just what was in the folder, but what it would actually do, what it would change, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering. It means the assumptions your parents have relied on are about to be challenged, he said, formally. And that word carried weight because it meant this was not just a conversation, not just a disagreement, this was something documented, something recognized, something that could not be dismissed or ignored the way everything else had been. I glanced down at the folder again, feeling that same sense of inevitability growing stronger, because whatever was inside it was no longer just an option, it was a turning point, and as I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the cover, I realized something I had never considered before. Maybe the role I had been given in this family was never fixed. Maybe it had just never been questioned, but that was about to change, and once it did, nothing would go back to the way it was before. I opened the folder slowly, not because it was heavy but because it felt like the weight was not in the paper but in what it represented. And the first thing I noticed was how organized everything was: tabs, dates, signatures, the kind of structure that does not happen overnight, the kind that builds over time, carefully, deliberately, like someone had been preparing for this moment long before I even knew. There was something to prepare for. My eyes moved across the first page: legal language, formal headings, names I recognized and details I did not. And then I saw it, my name, not as an afterthought, not buried in a paragraph, but centered, defined, specified, and I felt something shift in my chest, something unfamiliar, because I was not used to seeing myself placed at the center of anything in this family. Take your time, my grandfather said quietly, but I barely heard him because I was already reading, already trying to understand what I was looking at. There were references to trusts, to allocations, to conditions that had been outlined and then revised, and as I flipped to the next page, the pattern became clearer. My father's original structure, the one I had expected, the one where everything flowed toward Rachel, where I existed only on the margins, was there, documented, precise, exactly as I imagined it would be, but layered on top of it in a different ink with different signatures were changes, amendments, overrides, and each one of them pulled that structure apart piece by piece. What is this? I asked, my voice quieter now, not from uncertainty but from focus, because this was not just surprising, it was specific, intentional. It is a correction, my grandfather replied, and I looked up at him, trying to read his expression, but he remained calm, steady, like this was simply the natural progression of something that had been set in motion a long time ago. Your father assumed control over decisions that were not entirely his to make, he continued, and I allowed that assumption to stand for a while. There was a pause there, not long but enough to carry meaning, enough to suggest that allowance had never been permanent. Why? I asked, because that mattered, because if this had been happening for years, then it meant he had been watching all of it, every choice, every moment I was left to figure things out alone. And he nodded slightly like he expected the question. Because sometimes you need to see how a system operates before you can change it, he said. And that answer settled in a way that was both uncomfortable and clarifying, because it meant none of this had been invisible, none of it had gone unnoticed, it had been observed, evaluated, understood. And now, I pressed because the timing still mattered, because this morning could not just be coincidence, and he glanced at the folder briefly before answering. Now there is no ambiguity, he said. Today confirmed exactly how that system functions under pressure. And I felt that again, that shift, but stronger this time, because he was right. This was not just another moment, this was the moment everything became undeniable. They did not just overlook me, they actively chose not to show up when it mattered most, and that choice had consequences, not emotional ones, not just disappointment or distance, but something formal, something documented, something that now sat in my hands. I turned another page, and this time the language was clearer, direct allocations, specific provisions, conditions tied to behavior, and for the first time I saw something I had never expected to see: accountability, not implied, not suggested, but written, structured, enforceable. And my breath caught slightly. Because this was not just about giving me something, this was about redefining how things worked entirely. This changes everything. I said more to myself than to him, because I could feel it even without fully understanding every detail yet, and he gave a small nod, not surprised, not dramatic, just confirming what I was already starting to realize. It was meant to, he said, and I looked back down at the page, at my name, at the structure that now included me in a way it never had before. And for the first time I felt something that was not just survival, not just endurance, but position, like I was no longer standing outside something looking in, but actually part of it, and that was unfamiliar, almost unsettling, because I had spent so long building a life around not being included that I did not know what it meant to suddenly be accounted for. But one thing was clear: this was not just a quiet change behind the scenes, this was something that would eventually surface, something my parents would have to face. And when they did, it would not be a conversation they could dismiss or redirect the way they always had before. And as I closed the folder slowly, my hands steady now in a way they had not been earlier, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think until this moment. I was not the one who had to adjust anymore. They were. I did not realize how quiet the room had become until I heard my own breathing again. Steady now, controlled, nothing like the shallow, rushed breaths from earlier that morning. And it felt strange, almost disorienting, how quickly everything had shifted from panic to something else entirely. Not calm exactly, but clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and then all at once, like a light turning on in a room you have been sitting in for years without noticing how dark it actually was. I kept my hand resting on the folder, not gripping it, just touching it, like I needed to confirm it was real, that I had not imagined what I just read. They do not know about this, I said after a moment, my voice more certain than I expected. And my grandfather gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. No, he replied, they do not. And something in that answer carried weight, not just secrecy, but timing and tension, like this was not information meant to be revealed casually or prematurely. When will they find out? I asked, because that question felt inevitable, because something like this does not stay hidden forever, especially not in a family like mine where control and perception meant everything. And he leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his knees, his posture still composed but more focused now. Soon, he said. But not by accident. And I understood what he meant immediately. This was not going to be a quiet discovery, not a document stumbled upon or a conversation overheard. This was going to be presented formally, deliberately, in a way that could not be ignored or redirected. And I felt a small tightening in my chest at that thought. Not fear exactly, but anticipation, because I knew how my parents operated. I knew how quickly they dismissed anything that challenged their version of reality, how easily they reframed situations to maintain control. But this felt different. This was structured, documented, supported, and that meant they would not be able to simply talk their way out of it. There will be a meeting, my grandfather continued, confirming what I had already started to piece together, with legal counsel present. And that word again, legal, it kept appearing, reinforcing the idea that this was not just family conflict, this was something recognized, something enforceable, something that existed beyond personal opinion or emotional interpretation. You will be there, he added, and I looked up at him immediately because that was new, that was not how things usually worked. I was not included in those kinds of discussions. I was informed after the fact, if at all. Why me? I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, and he held my gaze steadily. Because this concerns you, he said simply, and that simplicity hit harder than any explanation could have. because it highlighted how unnatural that idea had always been in my family, that something affecting me should involve me, that my presence should be assumed rather than negotiated, and I felt that shift again, deeper this time, like something inside me was recalibrating, adjusting to a reality where I was no longer positioned on the outside. And Rachel? I asked quietly because I knew she would be there. I knew she would have opinions, reactions, expectations, and he did not hesitate. She will be there as well, he said. And she will not be expecting what she hears. And I could picture it already, the way she would stand, confident, certain, assuming everything would align with what she had always been told, what she had always believed. And then that moment when something did not match, when the structure she relied on did not hold the way it always had, and for the first time I realized that whatever happened next was not just about correcting the past, it was about redefining the future, not just for me but for all of us. You should rest, my grandfather said after a moment, his tone softening slightly. You have done enough for today. And I nodded because he was right, because my body was still recovering, because my mind had already taken in more than it could fully process at once. But as I leaned back against the pillow, closing my eyes briefly, I could not ignore the feeling settling in my chest. Something steady, something new, something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of strength, not the kind that comes from enduring everything alone, but the kind that comes from finally being seen, finally being accounted for. And as that thought settled, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. Whatever happened at that meeting, whatever my parents said or tried to argue or deny, it would not change what was already written. It would not undo what had already been set in motion. And for the first time in my life, I would not be the one adjusting to them. They would have to face something they could not control, and I did not realize it then, but that moment, lying there in that hospital bed with that folder still within reach, was the last moment things would feel even remotely familiar. I woke up again later that afternoon to the sound of small footsteps against tile and a soft voice trying very hard to whisper but failing, "Mommy?" And my eyes opened instantly because no matter how exhausted I was, that voice always cut through everything. And there they were, Oliver holding onto Mason's sleeve like they had decided not to separate even for a second, both of them standing just inside the doorway like they were not sure if they were allowed to come closer. And I felt something inside my chest tighten and release at the same time. "Hey," I said, my voice still a little weak but steadier than before, and they moved toward me quickly, climbing carefully onto the edge of the bed with the help of the nurse, their small hands reaching for mine like they needed to confirm I was really there, really awake. And I held on to them just as tightly because this was the part that mattered. This was the reason I had pushed through everything that morning, not for approval, not for support that never came, but for them. My grandfather stood just behind them, watching quietly, not interrupting, not directing, just making sure everything was where it needed to be. And I noticed something then that I had not fully registered earlier, the way the boys were calm, not anxious, not unsettled, which meant he had done more than just show up. He had taken care of them, properly, attentively, in a way that made them feel safe, and that realization settled deeper than I expected, because it highlighted the difference between presence and responsibility, between being there and actually showing up. "Did you eat?" I asked them, brushing Mason's hair back, and he nodded seriously. "Grandpa got us pancakes," he said, like that detail mattered more than anything else, and maybe it did because it meant someone had thought about what they needed, not just watched them but cared for them. "With strawberries," Oliver added, and I smiled despite everything because that sounded exactly like something my grandfather would do, simple, thoughtful, precise. "He even remembered no syrup for Mason," Oliver continued. And I felt my eyes flick toward my grandfather for just a second, because that was not something most people knew, not even my parents, and he gave a small nod like it was nothing, like paying attention was just standard, like remembering mattered. And I realized then that this was not new for him. He had always been observing, always noticing details others overlooked. I just had not been paying attention to it before, or maybe I had been too focused on everything else I was trying to manage. "Alone, you did good," I said quietly, looking at both boys but also meaning something more than just their behavior, and they smiled like that was enough, like my approval was all they needed. And that contrast hit me again, sharp and clear, because it showed me exactly what healthy support actually looked like, not complicated, not conditional, just present, just consistent. My grandfather stepped forward then, placing a small bag on the chair beside the bed. "They will need to head home soon," he said, his tone calm but structured like everything else he did. "I have already arranged for them to stay with me for a few days while you recover." And I blinked, processing that, because it was not a suggestion, it was a plan, already in motion, already handled, and my first instinct was to protest, to say I could manage, that I would figure it out like I always did, but the words did not come this time, Because for once I did not have to fill the gap, it had already been filled. Okay, I said instead, and even that felt unfamiliar, agreeing to help instead of rejecting it out of habit. And he nodded once, like that was the correct response, like things were aligning the way they were supposed to now. You should focus on recovery, he added. Everything else is already taken care of. And that sentence stayed with me, because it was something I had never heard before, not in a way that was real, not in a way that was actually true. Everything else is already taken care of. And as I watched him gather the boys' things, making sure nothing was left behind, checking details I usually had to track myself, I felt that shift again, but this time it was steady, grounded, not overwhelming, just present, because something fundamental had changed, not just in the documents I read, not just in the meeting that was coming, but in the way things were being handled right now, in real time. And I realized something I had not fully understood until this moment. Support was not supposed to feel like a rare exception, it was supposed to be the baseline, and for the first time I was starting to experience what that actually meant. But what I did not realize yet was that this quiet shift, this new structure, was only the beginning, because the real confrontation had not happened yet. And when it did, everything my parents believed about control, about hierarchy, about who mattered and who did not, was about to be tested in a way they were not prepared for. The first night without them was quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not comforting, just empty in a way that made every small sound feel louder. The hum of the hospital air conditioning, the distant footsteps in the hallway, the occasional beep of a monitor from another room, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to adjust to the idea that for once, I was not responsible for everything all at the same time, that my boys were somewhere safe, already fed, already settled, already cared for, and I did not have to plan the next hour or anticipate the next need. I did not have to calculate how to manage recovery while keeping 2 toddlers entertained and calm. That part had already been handled. And the more I thought about it, the more unfamiliar it felt, like I had been running at full speed for years and someone suddenly asked me to stop without warning. The next morning, the nurse helped me sit up slowly, reminding me to take it easy, to give my body time to heal, and I nodded, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying everything from the day before, the call from my father, the silence that followed, the moment my grandfather walked into that room, the folder, the documents, the realization that what I thought was fixed had never actually been permanent. You have a visitor, the nurse said mid-morning, and for a split second my chest tightened, because there was only one group of people I had not seen yet, the ones who had chosen not to come when it mattered, and I was not sure how I would feel if they showed up now, after everything had already shifted. But when the door opened, it was not them, it was my grandfather again, carrying a small paper bag. In one hand, in his usual calm expression. Breakfast, he said simply, setting the bag on the tray table, and I glanced inside to see a container of oatmeal, fresh fruit, and a cup of coffee, all arranged neatly, all exactly the kind of thing I would have tried to organize for myself if I had the energy. And I felt that same quiet recognition again, the difference between being expected to manage and having someone step in without being asked. How are they? I asked immediately, because that question came first now, always, and he gave a small nod. They slept through the night, he said. Oliver asked for you once, but Mason reminded him you were at the doctor. And I smiled at that, at the idea of them taking care of each other in their own small way. They will visit later today, he added, and I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief settle in, not urgent, not overwhelming, just steady. Good, I said quietly, and for a moment we sat in a kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, just present, like neither of us needed to fill it with unnecessary words. But then he shifted slightly, his posture straightening just enough to signal a change. And I felt it immediately, the shift. From quiet care to something more structured, more intentional. The meeting has been scheduled, he said, and just like that, everything I had been holding at the edges of my thoughts moved to the center. When? I asked, my voice steady even though I could feel my focus sharpening. 3 days from now, he replied, at my office, and that detail mattered because location was control and his office meant this was happening on his terms, not theirs. They have been informed, he added, and I felt a small, almost automatic reaction to that, trying to picture how my parents would respond, how my father would interpret it, how my mother would frame it, how Rachel would position herself within it. But for the first time, that mental exercise did not feel necessary, because whatever they thought or planned would not change what was already set in motion. What did they say? I asked, because curiosity was still there, even if the outcome no longer depended on it, and he gave a slight pause before answering. Your father was confident, he said, and I could hear the implication in that, the assumption, the belief that whatever this was, it would align with what he already expected, that he was still in control. And Rachel? I pressed because she was always part of the equation, always positioned at the center of it, and my grandfather's expression shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice but enough for me. She is certain this is a formality, he said, and that made sense because that was how it had always been presented to her, that everything was already decided, already structured in her favor, already secured, and for a moment I could almost feel what that confidence must be like, that certainty, that expectation. But then I looked at the folder still resting on the table beside me, and I realized something that grounded me instantly. Certainty only holds when it is based on the full picture, and they did not have that, not yet. They do not know, I said quietly, more as a statement than a question, and he shook his head once. No, he confirmed, and that was when I felt it fully, not just the shift, not just the clarity, but the difference in position, because for the first time I was not the one walking into a situation unprepared, not the one reacting, not the one adjusting after the fact. This time I knew something they did not. This time I had already seen what was coming, and as I sat there, the morning light filtering through the window, the hospital room no longer feeling like a place I was stuck in but a place I was passing through, I realized that the next time I saw my parents it would not be on their terms, it would not follow the same pattern, and whatever they thought was still in place was about to be questioned in a way they could not ignore, because this time the structure itself had changed, and they just did not know it yet. By the third day I was able to walk on my own, slowly, carefully, each step measured but steady, and there was something symbolic about that I could not ignore, like my body was catching up to what my mind had already started to process, that things were changing, not all at once, not dramatically, but in a way that was real, tangible, undeniable. My grandfather arrived early that morning, not rushed, not checking his watch, just present as always, and he handed me a neatly folded coat. "You will want this," he said, and I nodded, because even that small detail showed he had already thought ahead, already anticipated what I might need before I asked. The boys had been with him for 2 days now, and each time I spoke to them on the phone they sounded calm, settled, not confused or anxious, which told me everything I needed to know about how they were being cared for. And for the first time in a long time I was not dividing my attention between recovery and survival. I could actually focus on what was coming next, the meeting, the one my parents believed was a formality, the one Rachel expected to reinforce everything she had always been told, the one my father assumed he controlled. "Are you ready?" my grandfather asked as we walked toward the elevator, and I paused for just a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to recognize the moment for what it was. I was not walking into this the same way I had walked into every other interaction with my family. I was not bracing for dismissal, not preparing to adjust, not planning how to minimize myself to avoid conflict. This time, I was walking in knowing something they did not, holding information they had not accounted for, and that changed everything. "Yes," I said, and the word felt different than it ever had before, not forced, not defensive, just certain. His office was exactly as I remembered it, structured, organized, everything in its place, large windows letting in natural light, a long conference table at the center, and 2 people already seated when we entered, a man and a woman, both dressed professionally, both with folders in front of them, legal counsel, not observers, not passive participants but active, involved, which reinforced what I already knew. This was not going to be a conversation that could be redirected or dismissed. This was going to be documented, recorded, recognized. My grandfather gestured for me to sit beside him, positioning me at the table, not behind it, not off to the side, but directly involved, and that alone was enough to shift the dynamic before anyone else even arrived. A few minutes later the door opened again, and I felt it immediately, the change in the room, the familiar presence of my father, controlled, confident, followed by my mother, quieter, more reserved, and then Rachel, composed, assured, exactly as I expected. And for a brief moment, everything felt almost normal, like any other family interaction, like the same pattern was about to repeat itself. But then I remembered the folder, the documents, the structure that had already been rewritten, and that feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. "Emily," my mother said, her tone neutral, like she was not sure how to approach this, like she was trying to read the room before committing to a position. My father gave a small nod, acknowledging me but not engaging further, and Rachel offered a polite smile, the kind that assumed everything was still exactly as she expected it to be. "Let us begin," my grandfather said calmly, and the room settled immediately, because his voice carried authority in a way no one questioned, not even my father. The legal counsel opened their folders, documents sliding into place, structured, prepared, and I could see it then, the moment before everything shifted, the moment where they still believed they understood what was about to happen, the moment where their certainty was intact. And I realized something as I sat there, hands steady, posture aligned, no longer shrinking into the background, This was the last moment they would feel that way, because once those documents were read, once those decisions were presented, once the structure they relied on was laid out in full, nothing would remain the same, and for the first time I was not the one waiting to react. I was already prepared, already positioned, already part of what came next. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, a small, controlled sound that somehow carried more weight than anything said so far, and as he adjusted the papers in front of him, I watched the shift happen in real time, not in movement, not in words, but in awareness, like the room itself was preparing for something irreversible. We are here to review the finalized structure of the Carter estate and associated trusts. He began. His tone measured, neutral, but precise in a way that left no room for interpretation, and I could see my father lean back slightly in his chair, relaxed, confident, like this was exactly what he expected, like this was just a confirmation of decisions already made. Rachel mirrored that posture, composed, assured, her hands folded neatly in front of her, while my mother remained quieter, her eyes moving between the documents and my grandfather, trying to read something that had not yet been said. We will begin with the original allocations, the lawyer continued. And as he outlined them, it was exactly what I already knew, exactly what I had lived my entire life preparing for without ever being directly told. The majority directed toward Rachel's structured advantages, long-term assets, protections, everything positioned around her future, her stability, her value within the family framework. And I felt something settle inside me, not disappointment, not even surprise, just confirmation, like hearing something out loud that had always been implied. My father gave a small nod as the lawyer spoke, almost approving, like he was listening to his own logic being repeated back to him. Like this was all perfectly reasonable, perfectly justified, perfectly aligned with how things should be. And now, the lawyer said, pausing just long enough to shift the attention in the room, we will review the amendments. And that was the moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. I saw it first in my grandfather, the way he remained completely still, completely composed, as if nothing about this moment was unexpected to him. And then I saw it in the lawyer's posture, more deliberate now, more focused, like he was moving into something that required precision. These amendments were filed and executed under the authority of William Carter, he continued, and I felt my father's attention sharpen immediately. A slight shift forward, subtle, but there, because this was no longer just a summary of his decisions, this was something else, something outside of his control. The revised structure introduces conditions tied to demonstrated responsibility, support, and active participation in family obligations. The lawyer read, and I watched Rachel's expression flicker, just slightly, confusion breaking through her certainty for the first time. Additionally, he continued, specific allocations have been reassigned to reflect consistent contribution and demonstrated independence under unsupported conditions. And that was when it landed, not just in the words but in the meaning behind them, because this was not abstract, this was not theoretical, this was about behavior, about patterns, about choices, about who showed up and who did not. Primary beneficiary adjustments include the designation of Emily Carter as a direct recipient under the revised trust structure, the lawyer said clearly, and the silence that followed was immediate. Absolute, the kind that fills every corner of a room and leaves no space for denial. My father's expression did not change at first, not visibly, but I could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the reassessment, the realization that this was not aligning with what he expected. My mother's gaze dropped briefly to the table, then back up, like she was trying to process the shift without fully understanding it yet, and Rachel, for the first time since she walked in, was no longer composed, her posture tightening slightly, her hands no longer resting as easily as before. This reallocation is supported by documented patterns of independent financial responsibility, consistent caregiving, and lack of familial support during critical circumstances, the lawyer added, and that line settled heavily because it was not just about numbers or assets, it was about narrative, about reality being recorded in a way that could not be dismissed or rewritten. That is not. My father started, his voice controlled but edged now, but the lawyer did not stop, did not pause, did not yield. All amendments are legally binding and were executed in accordance with existing authority provisions within the original estate structure. He finished, and that was the moment the room shifted completely, because this was no longer a discussion, no longer something open to interpretation. This was established, documented, finalized, and I sat there, hands steady, heart calm in a way I did not expect, watching the structure I had lived under my entire life being rewritten in Real time, not by argument, not by emotion, but by something far more definitive, and for the first time I was not the one trying to be seen, I was already accounted for. But what they did next, what they said in response to that moment, was something I could not fully predict, because this was the point where everything they believed about control, about certainty, about who held authority was being challenged directly, and they were not prepared for it. The silence did not break immediately. And that was the part that stayed with me the most, not the words, not the documents, but the pause, the exact moment where everything they believed was still trying to hold together before reality caught up to it. My father was the first to move, a small shift in his chair, a tightening of his jaw, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable if you knew him. "This is highly irregular," he said finally, his voice measured, the same tone he used whenever he believed something could still be redirected. If he stayed calm enough, authoritative enough, but the difference this time was clear. No one responded to that tone the way they used to. Not the lawyer, not my grandfather, not even my mother, who simply remained still, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. The authority to amend these structures was clearly defined. The lawyer replied evenly, not defensive, not reactive, just stating a fact that existed whether my father accepted it or not. And I could see it then, the moment where my father realized this was not something he could talk around, not something he could dismiss with logic or reposition with confidence. "You are saying these changes override the original allocations," he said more directly now, and the lawyer nodded once. "That is correct." And there it was, simple, final, not open for negotiation. Rachel shifted beside him, her composure slipping just enough to show what she was thinking, confusion first, then calculation, then something closer to disbelief. "That does not make sense," she said, her voice controlled but tighter than before. The structure was already finalized, and my grandfather turned his head slightly toward her, not sharply, not confrontationally, just enough to acknowledge the statement. "It was never final," he said calmly, and those 4 words landed harder than anything else in the room. Because they did not just challenge the documents, they challenged the assumption behind them, the belief that everything had already been decided, already secured, already untouchable. "You let us believe it was," my father said, and there was something new in his tone now, not anger exactly but strain, like he was trying to maintain control over something that was already slipping. "I allowed you to operate within your assumptions," my grandfather replied, his voice steady, unchanged, "until those assumptions were tested." And I felt that again, that clarity, because this was not random, this was not sudden, this was the result of observation, of time, of patterns being allowed to play out until they revealed themselves completely. And what exactly triggered this? My father asked, and for the first time his attention shifted directly toward me, not dismissively, not passively, but with focus, like he was trying to understand where I fit into something he had not anticipated. My grandfather did not hesitate. "Consistency," he said, and then after a brief pause and absence, and the room went quiet again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not waiting, but settled, like the answer had already been given and there was nothing left to argue against. My mother finally spoke then, her voice softer, more uncertain than I had ever heard it. "This is about what happened this week," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and my grandfather nodded once. "This week confirmed what had already been observed," he said, and I felt my father's gaze on me again, sharper now, more direct, like he was reassessing something he had overlooked for years, something he had categorized too quickly, too easily. "You think one situation changes everything," he said, and I met his gaze without hesitation, not defensive, not emotional, just steady. "It was not one situation," I said, and my voice did not shake, not even slightly, because I knew that now, fully, clearly. It was every time. And for a moment no one spoke, not because they could not, but because there was nothing left to reframe, nothing left to minimize. The pattern had already been named, already documented, already built into something they could not ignore. My grandfather leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that signaled finality rather than withdrawal. "The structure now reflects reality," he said, and that was it, not an argument, not a justification, just a statement of what existed. And I sat there, feeling something settle into place that I had never experienced before, not validation in the way I used to imagine it, not approval, but alignment, like the external structure finally matched what I had been living internally for years. And as I looked around that table at the expressions shifting, the certainty fading, the control redistributing, I realized something I had not fully understood until that moment. I had spent my entire life adjusting to fit into a system that was never designed for me, but now that system had been rewritten, and for the first time I did not have to prove my place within it. It had already been defined, but what they chose to do with that reality, how they responded to it after this moment, was something I could not control, and for the first time I did not need to.